Welcome to Medmarc's Risk Management webinar series. I am Heather Thompson, Director of Internet Marketing for Medmarc. I'm so pleased to kick off today's annual presentation, Ripped from the Headlines, Hot Topics in Life Sciences, with our very own risk management team members, Kate, Klaus, and Zuhal Reed. Kate and Zuhal are both members of our Medmarc Risk Management Services team. They work closely with clients to help identify exposures, review contracts, provide guidance on regulatory standards, and build risk mitigation strategies. This is a great service that we offer to our policyholders, and they have access to our risk management team for all kinds of guidance on best practices. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Kate, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Heather. And welcome everyone to our annual Ripped from the Headlines presentation, in which we attempt to break down the life sciences implications of breaking news headlines. And given that we are in a post-election news cycle and transition to a new administration, there seems to be nothing but breaking news these days. So let's get into it. Our first topic is changes ahead for over-the-counter cold medications. This is an important topic for all of us, particularly as we head into cold and flu season. And these pending changes have to do with one specific active ingredient, phenylephrine. Following the 2005 Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, that was when, in order to prevent the proliferation of methamphetamine on the streets, there was an act passed that required all drugs containing methamphetamine precursors to be moved behind the pharmacy counter. So drugs like Sudafed and other common cold medications had to be moved behind the pharmacy counter. They would put these little pieces of paper out on the shelves. You could bring those to the pharmacist and they would give the medication to you, and they would log your name as a purchaser. And one of the changes that was made by manufacturers following this act was to introduce phenylephrine as a substitute for pseudoephedrine, which was the methamphetamine precursor. This became a really popular option for manufacturers who wanted to keep physical product on the shelves and not just behind the pharmacy counter. Because over-the-counter drugs are regulated via a monograph system, where FDA identifies the acceptable active ingredients, the particular dosage that is needed for each, the claims that can be made about what the product does. It's really very simple for the manufacturers to make a shift like this. They don't have to go through a new approval process. They can change out the active ingredient. And as long as they have updated their labeling, they've informed FDA of the change, and they're keeping all of the documentation on their end that they need to comply with good manufacturing practices, then it's relatively easy for them to just move forward with the sales. However, over the years since the introduction of phenylephrine, there has been a lot of data gathered on the safety and effectiveness of this as an active ingredient in cold medications. And while phenylephrine is very safe, it's been discovered that it is not actually an effective decongestant. When it is absorbed into the body through an oral dosage form, it really doesn't translate the same way that pseudoephedrine does. By the time it makes its way through the intestines and into the bloodstream, only about 38% of the active is making its way through to the body versus a closer to 100% rate in pseudoephedrine. Phenylephrine is very effective as a nasal spray when it is applied directly to the nasal tissue and the sinuses, but when it is absorbed orally, it does not have that same efficacy. So what is FDA doing about it? In 2023, an FDA advisory committee on over-the-counter drugs recommended that phenylephrine be removed from the over-the-counter drug monograph for cold medications, nasal decongestants. And in its typical speedy fashion, a year and change later, FDA has introduced a proposed order to remove phenylephrine from this monograph. Because they have to allow for public comment, this order is going to be open. This proposed order, I should say, is going to be open through next May, giving the public 6 months to comment on the proposal to remove just the oral dosage form of phenylephrine from the monograph. And after that time, FDA will be free to either make this a final order, in which case the products will have to be removed from store shelves, or they may just let it sit in a tentative state, a proposed state, indefinitely if a different decision is made. And given the fact that there is a new administration coming in and there's going to be new leadership at FDA, that's always a possibility. But in the meantime, we should prepare for products like these to start leaving store shelves in their current form, and adjust to the fact that until there is a new substitute for the product version that is permitted to be out on the store shelf, we may just have to be going to the pharmacy counter to request any cold medications that we need that may be held behind the pharmacy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zuhal for our next topic.
Thank you, Kate. Now let's dive into the FDA's new quality systems final rule for medical devices, which is one of the most significant regulatory updates in recent years. To start, the current quality system regulation, or QSR framework, is being modernized to align with ISO 13485 standards. This is a global standard for medical device quality systems that's already used by many companies internationally. The goal of this change is to harmonize US requirements with global best practices, which will create more consistency across markets and simplify compliance for manufacturers that operate in multiple countries. To start, the current QSR framework is the foundation of the FDA's approach to ensuring the safety and effectiveness of medical devices marketed in the United States. Established under 21 CFR Part 820, the QSR framework outlines the minimum requirements for the design, manufacture, packaging, labeling, storage, and servicing of medical devices. In simpler terms, it's a set of rules that medical device manufacturers must follow to ensure their products are consistently safe and effective for use by patients and healthcare providers. The QSR framework is it's process-oriented, which means it focuses on how companies develop and manufacture medical devices rather than just evaluating the final product. For example, it requires manufacturers to implement processes like risk management, design controls, document control, corrective and preventative actions, or CAPA, and supplier quality management. These processes create a robust system where potential issues can be identified and resolved early, ideally before they result in defective or dangerous devices reaching the market. One of the key strengths of the QSR framework is its flexibility. It allows manufacturers to tailor their quality systems to their specific products and processes. However, this flexibility has also been a challenge for companies operating globally. The QSR framework is specific to the United States, and complying with it doesn't always align with international standards. This creates inefficiencies for manufacturers who need to meet different sets of requirements in other markets, such as Europe, where ISO 13485 is the primary quality system standard. So now let's shift and talk about ISO 13485 and how it differs from the QSR framework. ISO 13485 is an internationally recognized standard for quality management systems in the medical device industry. While the QSR focuses on regulatory compliance in the United States, ISO 13485 takes a more global approach, emphasizing harmonization and consistency across borders. This is especially important for manufacturers that operate in multiple countries or those aiming to enter new international markets. A significant difference between the two frameworks is their emphasis on risk management. While the QSR does include risk-based requirements, ISO 13485 places a much stronger emphasis on a risk-based approach throughout the entire product lifecycle, from design and development right through to post-market surveillance. It also incorporates more detailed requirements for supplier management, making companies more accountable for the quality of components and services provided by external suppliers. Another key distinction is documentation. The QSR framework requires manufacturers to document their processes and maintain records, but ISO 13485 places even greater importance on documentation, particularly in terms of traceability. For instance, ISO 13485 requires companies to document risk assessments, validation activities, and other quality-related processes in a way that ensures these records are available for internal audits or inspections by regulators in any country that recognizes the ISO standard. And lastly, ISO 13485 is designed to integrate with other international standards, such as ISO 14971 for risk management, making it a more comprehensive framework for global operations. The QSR, on the other hand, has largely stood alone as a US-specific regulation, which can create challenges for companies that need to align their quality systems with multiple regulatory frameworks. Understanding these differences highlights why the FDA's decision to align the QSR with ISO 13485 is so incredibly significant. By adopting these international standards, the FDA is aiming to create a more unified approach. So why is this so important? First, aligning with ISO 13485 addresses the challenges that many medical device companies face when complying with different regulatory frameworks in various regions. It's a move towards streamlining the process, reducing redundancies, and making it easier for companies to expand internationally. But it's also a double-edged sword because it introduces new expectations that could require overhauls of existing quality management systems. Now, from a regulatory perspective, this change means companies will need to review and potentially adjust their internal quality processes to meet the updated standards. It also increases scrutiny and audits. The FDA will likely evaluate compliance not just with updated QSR framework, but also with ISO 13485. Now, let's consider the implications for litigation and liability exposure. So historically, noncompliance with FDA regulations has been a key factor in product liability lawsuits. Under the updated rule, plaintiffs may try to argue that failure to meet ISO 13485 standards, now essentially the law in the US, is evidence of negligence. This could increase the risk of lawsuits if companies are not being proactive in implementing these changes. So what does that mean for medical device companies? In short, what it means is preparation is critical. To get ready for this change, medical device companies should start by conducting a gap analysis to identify where their current quality systems diverge from ISO 13485 requirements. Engage with regulatory experts and consultants who can guide this transition. And additionally, ensure your internal teams are trained on the updated standards to minimize the risk of noncompliance. In the meantime, it's essential to stay informed. So use this time to get ahead. I'd always recommend to monitor FDA guidance documents as they become available to clarify how these updates will be, how these different and new updates will be enforced over time. To wrap up, this update is definitely a significant shift, but with the right preparation, it can ultimately, hopefully be a positive change for the industry. Back to you, Kate.
Thank you. Our next topic is direct-to-consumer advertising for prescription drugs. So I wanted to start off by talking a bit about the jurisdiction over drug advertising. There has been an agreement in place between FDA and the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, for decades that breaks down advertising jurisdiction. And essentially, FDA has carved out this one area where it is in control of advertising regulations, and that is prescription drugs. All other drugs, devices, cosmetics, foods, dietary supplements, that is within the jurisdiction of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And the FTC does frequently weigh in on claims that are inappropriate, ads that are inappropriate, things that are not meeting the standard for advertising, which is to be truthful and not misleading. But in this case, we're talking about prescription drug advertising specifically. And we frequently hear these ads both on TV, on radio, they're online as well, but typically those are treated more like a static magazine ad rather than something that has, it's not going to stay in place long enough for you to fully read about it. You're just listening to, seeing, hearing what is being offered to you. And what FDA's regulations in this area have traditionally done is focus on a fair balance of the information presented. In addition to advertising the potential benefits for a drug, the conditions that it can treat, who the appropriate user is, it's also critical that they present the risks, the side effects, the warnings, anything that needs to be disclosed about potential problems or detriments that might happen if you were to use the product. And prescription drug advertising is incredibly successful for companies manufacturing these products. Many studies have shown that doctors are much more likely to prescribe a new prescription drug when the patient inquires about it specifically, rather than just sending sales reps out to meet with doctors. If a patient is asking, as they're directed to in all of these ads, if they are asking their doctor about a specific medication, they are much more likely to receive it. However, over time, the warning information has become less balanced and more obscure. I am absolutely going to be dating myself with this reference, but many of the warning disclosures have begun to sound like they were read by the Micro Machines guy from the 80s and 90s toy commercials. He would put auctioneers to shame with the speed that he could speak. And this is happening more and more with all of these warning sections of prescription drug ads. There are also frequently distracting visuals or music that are competing for the viewers, the listeners' attention. Because this need for transparency about the risks and the benefits of the products is so vital to any potential direct-to-consumer prescription advertising, FDA issued an update to its direct-to-consumer advertising guidance. And this update is focused on clear, conspicuous, and neutral delivery of any ad warning information. The previous guidance was issued in 2015, so this was really a long overdue change. The update was issued a year ago, and we're talking about it again because the compliance deadline is effective today. So starting today, any drug companies who are issuing ads that do not meet the new standards presented in this rule are subject to enforcement action by FDA. And the 5 new standards that are presented in this update to the drug advertising guidance are all focused on making this information clear and accessible. So number 1, warnings have to be presented in a consumer-friendly, easily understandable language. So it has to be, commonly used words. It's not supposed to be the direct wording that's in the package insert. Package inserts are drafted for providers, for doctors. It's not consumer-friendly labeling information. And if you are choosing to put consumer-friendly advertising language into your ad, then you can absolutely come up with consumer-friendly language for all of the necessary warning information as well. Number 2, the warnings must be at least as understandable as the rest of the ad. So if you have your person skipping through a field or riding on a horse as they're talking about whatever condition has been cured by this wonderful medication. If all of that is easily heard and understood by the viewer, the listener, then you can't speed talk through the warnings either. They have to be equal to each other. It has to be a balance of the information. If you are advertising on TV, number 3 says that the warnings must be delivered concurrently in both audio and in text. So you can't just put up a tiny image of the package insert and then have someone speed talk while music is playing. Instead, you have to be able to see key words from the package insert or keywords that reinforce what the speaker is saying about the warning information. Number 4, on TV, the written warnings must be easily readable. So it has to be the same kind of text size, font, contrast between, the background and the written text. They have to be able to access the information if they're trying to read it on the screen as well. Having tiny print or a tiny ticker at the bottom is not accessible to the average viewer. So it's critical that the warning language that is being called out is, visible long enough for it to be read in a size that makes it able to be read. Number 5, no other audio or visual component of the ad can interfere with the ability to understand any warnings that are being presented in the warning section of the ad itself. However, this is not the only challenge for direct-to-consumer advertising. The clear, conspicuous, and neutral update is the first direct-to-consumer update since 2015, as you mentioned. And in the intervening years, there has been a massive upheaval in social media advertising, in the advertising landscape altogether. Sites like TikTok and Instagram are rife with micro-influencers. These are content creators with 1,000 to 100,000 followers. And because they have a smaller, more manageable platform, they're able to interact with their followers more so than a celebrity might be able to do. This tends to create the feeling of creates a parasocial relationship, which is the feeling that this content creator is a friend rather than someone you follow on a website. They feel it feels more personal, and therefore there is a greater degree of trust in their opinions, and it gives their message a greater feeling of authenticity to people who regularly receive their content. Influencer campaigns are incredibly common for cosmetics and dietary supplements, and there is a lot of concern about this bleeding into the drug advertising space, particularly with products like GLP-1s, drugs like Ozempic. Some of them are being compounded and sold through Instagram ads. There are influencers who use them. There's a lot of concern that there is a lack of parity in the information that's being presented. If this was to become a paid practice by the manufacturers, it would be a much more significant issue than it currently is. And it's hard to say how the new administration will treat this this gap in the regulations. There's been a lot of push in Congress to do something right away. In the new administration, the proposed or the nominated director or Secretary of Health and Human Services, who would have a lot of influence over FDA as well. He is a very vocal critic of direct-to-consumer advertising, but equally on the other side, very vocal about wanting to get or alternative health information out to consumers. So it's really unclear how this particular type of advertising would be would be addressed going forward, which is why there is some push to take care of it at the legislative level in the near term. And with that, I will turn it back over to Zuhal.
Thank you, Kate. Now, I'm going to shift the focus to an important regulatory development that has been some time in the making, the FDA's final rule for laboratory developed tests, or LDTs. Now, historically, LDTs have occupied a unique regulatory gray area. LDTs are a specific type of in vitro diagnostic device, or IVD, but unlike most IVDs, which are typically manufactured and sold to multiple laboratories, LDTs are developed, validated, and used within a single laboratory. Because of this, LDTs were traditionally regulated under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment, or CLIA, which focused primarily on laboratory quality and personnel qualifications rather than the safety or effectiveness of individual tests. In addition to CLIA, oversight of LDTs has also been influenced by state laws and professional accreditation organizations such as the College of American Pathologists, or CAP. Some states impose additional licensing requirements for labs, while organizations like CAP establish their own inspection and accreditation standards, which can include more stringent quality controls than those required under CLIA. Despite these layers of oversight, there has been no unified federal framework specifically addressing the safety and effectiveness of LDTs as diagnostic tools. The FDA, until now, largely exercised enforcement discretion, meaning they chose not to actively regulate LDTs as medical devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. This hands-off approach was based on the assumption that LDTs were simple, low-risk tests developed by highly specialized laboratories for specific patient populations. However, advances in technology, particularly in molecular diagnostics and genomics, have transformed LDTs into highly complex tests with broad public health implications. For example, LDTs are now used for cancer screenings, genetic testings, and even prenatal testing, areas where the potential for harm from inaccurate or poorly validated tests is significant. Recognizing these risks, the FDA has issued a final rule to regulate LDTs as medical devices. This represents a major policy shift aimed at ensuring that these tests meet the same rigorous standards as other medical devices. The FDA's goal is to protect public health by subjecting LDTs to pre-market review, quality system regulations, and post-market monitoring. Under this rule, LDTs will no longer be exempt from the medical device regulatory framework. Instead, they will need to meet requirements for clinical validity, analytical validity, and safety. Basically, this means proving not only that the test performs as intended, but also that it leads to better patient outcomes without introducing unnecessary risks. The FDA's approach to implementing this rule is phased to minimize disruption while giving labs time to adapt. The first phase of policy implementation is set to begin May 2025. During this initial phase, manufacturers of high-risk LDTs, those that are used for critical diagnoses like cancer or infectious diseases, will need to submit pre-market approval applications, or PMAs, or meet other FDA requirements. Now, lower risk LDTs will be phased in later, giving their manufacturers more time to understand and comply with the new requirements. However, even in this first phase, laboratories will face significant challenges because many of them have never been subject to FDA regulations before in this way. The implications of this rule for LDT manufacturers are profound. First and foremost, there will be increased regulatory scrutiny. Labs that develop and offer LDTs will need to invest in resources to demonstrate compliance with FDA standards. This includes submitting detailed documentation, conducting validation studies, and implementing robust quality management systems. Additionally, manufacturers will need to create transition plans to align their operations with FDA requirements. This involves everything from staff training to redesigning your quality systems to preparing for FDA inspections. Now let's talk about the challenges and considerations this rule presents for manufacturers and even the industry at large. What I think we can expect is that labs will invest heavily in compliance infrastructure, including regulatory experts, quality systems, and validation studies. Also, laboratories will need to revamp their processes to comply with FDA regulations. This could include significant delays in test development timelines, which might affect the availability of critical diagnostic tests. Another side of this is the increased regulatory scrutiny that also opens the door to greater legal liability. If a lab fails to meet FDA requirements, it could face enforcement actions, product recalls, or even potentially litigation. To prepare for this transition, manufacturers definitely need to act now, and it would start with conducting a gap analysis to identify where the current operations fall short of FDA requirements, engage with regulatory experts to develop a comprehensive compliance strategy, and finally, to stay informed about the guidance documents and timelines as the FDA rolls out their new policy. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. And I am going to continue with a bit more on lab developed tests because that is most likely not the end of the story. It is possible that the entire laboratory developed test framework could be turned on its head altogether. There are two distinct possibilities that could prevent the rule from ever taking effect. First, during the Trump administration, FDA regulation of lab-developed tests was halted. This was in part due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the fact that there was an increased need in flexibility and speed of access to new lab-developed tests. But despite this, it is fairly likely that the second Trump administration would take up its former position anyway, because there were arguments made at that time that FDA lacked the statutory authority to regulate lab-developed tests. So the position of the administration was that this wasn't within FDA's jurisdiction, and therefore the rule was inappropriate. And further, the potential Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he has stated that he wants the federal health agencies to focus less on infectious disease and more on preventive care. This could have some impact on the resources that are available within FDA to address lab-developed tests, even if the rule were to be implemented. If entire departments within FDA are eliminated, it's hard to say what resources would remain to make this an actual possibility to have FDA be effective in regulating these types of products. The other issue, and one that is really fairly significant, is a change at the Supreme Court level. In the 2023-2024 term, the court's ruling in the Loper-Bright case really changed the entire landscape for administrative law. In short, previously where any agency within the executive branch made some type of regulation, if there was ambiguity in the regulation, if there was a disagreement between industry and the agency with regard to the interpretation of a regulation, the court used the long-standing Chevron doctrine in really giving credence to the agency's expertise. courts would defer to the agency's interpretation of the regulation, because these agencies have people who are, lifelong civil servants who are experts in the work that they do. At FDA, there are people who are experts in drugs, in devices, in biologics, and these people are so involved in the intricacies of ensuring that there is a safe supply of product on the market, that they are expected to know better than the court how the regulation is intended to be implemented. And the court did give deference to that expertise for, it was about 40 years. However, with the Loper-Bright decision, the Chevron doctrine has been overturned. And in the case of lab-developed tests, this could be one of the first significant indications of what the Chevron reversal is going to mean for FDA. Because the Chevron doctrine has been overturned and there is no longer any deference to FDA's interpretation of regulations, it becomes the jurisdiction of the court to determine if there is ambiguity in the regulation, what does it actually mean? How is it intended to be interpreted? And in the case of lab-developed tests, it is highly likely that that case would be made. I believe there is one pending already, because manufacturers, industry, they were never really on board with this change in the regulations. So highly likely it will reach the court, but the issue then is, which court does it reach? What is the decision of that court? If there is a case in a separate circuit and there's a separate or different decision that is made, do we have to wait for every issue to come up to the Supreme Court to have that difference in rulings to reach a final outcome on what the final ruling is? This could drastically slow down progress at every administrative agency, and a lot of confusion for industry in the meantime. So we will be keeping our eye on that, and reporting back as soon as we have information. And with that, I will turn it back to Zuhal.
Thank you. Let's now dive into the FDA's proposed rule for biosimilars, an important regulatory change that could have significant implications. To begin, it's essential to first understand the distinction between biologics and biosimilars. Biologics are complex, large molecule drugs derived from living cells, often used to treat serious illnesses such as cancer, autoimmune disorders, and rare diseases. These products are highly specific in their actions and are much more complex than traditional small molecule drugs like aspirin. Examples of biologics include monoclonal antibodies like Humira or therapeutic proteins like insulin. Biosimilars, on the other hand, are drugs that are highly similar to an already FDA-approved biologic product known as the reference product. While biosimilars are not identical to their reference products due to the inherent variability in biological manufacturing, they must demonstrate no clinically meaningful difference in terms of safety, purity, or potency. This makes them a cost-effective alternative to biologics, promoting competition and accessibility in the pharmaceutical market. Now, under the current U.S. regulatory framework, biosimilars must go through additional studies to achieve what's called interchangeable status. But what does that mean? Interchangeability is a designation granted by the FDA that allows a biosimilar to be substituted for its reference biologic at the pharmacy level without requiring a prescriber's intervention, much like generic drugs. This status is crucial because it encourages adoption by simplifying access for patients and healthcare providers, hopefully ultimately leading to broader market acceptance of biosimilars. Now, currently, to obtain this designation, biosimilar manufacturers have to conduct what are called switching studies. These studies demonstrate that a patient can safely switch back and forth between the biosimilar and the reference product without compromising safety or efficacy. While these studies are important, they add significant cost and time to biosimilar development, creating barriers for manufacturers and slowing down the availability of affordable alternatives. The FDA's proposed rule, if adopted, will hopefully streamline the pathway for a biosimilar approval by eliminating the requirement for switching studies to achieve interchangeability. Instead, the focus will shift to ensuring robust analytical comparability and high-quality clinical data to confirm that the biosimilar matches the reference product in terms of safety, efficacy, and immunogenicity. This approach aligns with regulatory practices in the European Union, where biosimilars are not subject to switching study requirements. The EU has been using this streamlined framework for years, and it's proven to be highly effective. Under the proposed rule, manufacturers will still need to demonstrate analytical comparability, meaning they must prove that the biosimilar and its reference product are nearly identical in structure and function. Additionally, clinical studies will focus on confirming that the biosimilar produces the same therapeutic outcomes as the reference product. This approach removes redundancy while still maintaining rigorous scientific standards for biosimilar approval. This regulatory change offers several significant benefits for biosimilar manufacturers. First, it reduces the cost and the time required for biosimilar development by removing the need for expensive switching studies. What we might see is that this rule lowers barriers to entry for smaller manufacturers, potentially fostering greater competition in the market. Second, it allows manufacturers to allocate resources more effectively, focusing on analytical comparability, marketing strategies, and patient education, rather than on costly clinical trials. And lastly, by aligning with the EU's regulatory framework, it would also simplify global development strategies for manufacturers that are already operating or attempting to operate in multiple markets. Now, for the pharmaceutical industry at large, this proposed rule represents a major step forward in creating a more competitive and efficient biosimilar market. It has the potential to increase the availability of biosimilars, to drive down drug costs, and to improve patient access to life-saving therapies. However, if the rule is adopted, it also means manufacturers will need to adapt quickly to the new requirements, investing in advanced analytical tools and processes to meet the FDA's new expectations. In addition, education will likely play a key role both for prescribers and patients to ensure confidence in biosimilars as interchangeable, effective alternatives to the reference biologics they're already used to. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kate.
Thank you. And our final topic for today is, of course, AI, and the truly impossible task that is before FDA of having to regulate one of the hottest technologies out there. And the issue for FDA really is that their device paradigm is the same that it has always been. It is based on a static and unchanging design and the ability to validate that design to ensure that it's going to operate the same way every single time. And it has been forced in the last few years to really adapt to technology that is intended to change. That is part of its design. And what they have done is they have looked to the AI life cycle as a way to really wrap their arms around products that are designed to change over time. And when you're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, that is somewhat of an easier prospect to understand, because the way that the device grows is through the data that is inputted into the system. As the product gets more and more data, it is able to refine its operation. The manufacturer of the product has to build and test its model to ensure that The way that it has been structured is going to work. They have to ensure that they're able to validate the way that the information is being processed. And then over time, they are relying on monitoring of the information going in and the outputs, and monitoring the real world performance of the product over time. So if you're talking about a screening device that is intended to review pictures of moles and identify skin cancers, there is so much data out there that is able to be fed into the model to build the model, and all of these markers of what should be evaluated for the presence of skin cancers helps this model to develop and improve over time. The more information it has to work with, the better it will be. It'll start catching those outliers that it may have missed previously if information is continually fed into the model. The issue for the manufacturer is that they have to continue to assess what is going in, because that model is only as good as the data. If it's being fed bad data, that could start to impact the effectiveness of the tool itself. And so there have been ways to address the intended changes in AI machine learning devices. But that is much, much different than what is being considered right now. FDA's advisory committee on generative AI is meeting as we speak today and tomorrow. And they are trying to gather information about how and whether a product that is not just responding to data, but actually creating new synthetic data is appropriate, and how it can be safely deployed in the healthcare space. It is an incredibly complex model to wrap your brain around. But the foundational question that this committee is starting with is, as it always is for FDA, first, is the product a medical device? Going right back to FDA's most basic definitions. Is it an instrument, an apparatus, an implement, a machine, a contrivance, an implant, an in vitro reagent, or any component, part, or accessory thereof that is intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease or condition? If the product is not falling within that definition, then it is not within FDA's jurisdiction. And therefore, it would not be appropriate for FDA to respond to that type of a product. And then if the product is deploying an artificial intelligence machine learning model, like the scanning as a diagnostic tool, that is something where FDA has found its workarounds. It has a lot of information on the AI life cycle. The de novo pathway to approval is available to these companies. And of course, we're seeing it all the time. I pulled this particular shot this morning. So just within the last day, these are 4 more AI tools that have gotten FDA approval for use in patients. So this is clearly something that is incredibly important, not just to industry, but to patients who are in desperate need of accessing this information. But it will be interesting to see what comes from this advisory committee meeting that is occurring this week with regard to generative AI enabled devices. There is thought that this could expand a lot of pathways that will improve treatment for patients. So if A model is allowed to continue to grow beyond just what the inputs are, but to start to generate new information. It is possible that, tools that had not been considered could result from the deployment of that type of a generative model. There is potential for this to be, um, highly beneficial, but at this point, it is speculative to the point that it is a significant risk. It is where the product is not just constantly changing, but creating its own information, ensuring that that information is going to be reliable and will not involve some sort of a safety risk for the patients. Determining how that assurance can be provided is going to be an ongoing and incredibly complex challenge for years to come. And we will be interested in what the committee puts forward and any potential changes to the regulatory scheme thereafter. And again, there are a lot of changes on the horizon given the change in leadership and comments that have been made about wanting to shake up the way these agencies operate. So we will see. Again, this is a topic where we can't really provide a picture of what is going to come from this education of the agency, but we will be watching and ready to report back. And with that, I think we have wrapped our presentation for today. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I will turn it back over to you, Heather.
All right. Thank you, Kate and Zuhal. I can't believe you can summarize all that in an hour's time, and the 2024 hot topics into just 1 hour is amazing. So if you want to stay on top of the latest industry topics in 2025, I'm sure there'll be plenty of them to follow. Subscribe to our newsletter on medmarc.com, and it will provide you with future webinar invitations and blog posts on current life sciences industry topics. And you'll see what 2025 has in store for us.